Okay, so today we're going to take a little bit of a diversion from urbanism and we're going to look a little bit more at specific architectural movements that were happening in the latter half of the 20th century, specifically postmodernism. And we'll touch briefly at the end of the lecture on corporate urbanism and how some of this manifests. But basically, this lecture is kind of a little bit of a prologue to a lecture that's coming up in the Module 5 that will talk about how postmodern ideas of architecture translated into urban planning, particularly in the 1990s and in the 21st century. So we're kind of in that moment. We had just looked at kind of what was happening in the 1970s with John Portman and fortress architecture and kind of the negative state and economic decline and all the other kind of complicated factors that went into the decline of the city in the 1960s to 1970s. The economy starts to boom in the 1980s, and all of a sudden the cities just have an explosion of growth. So there's a lot of new skyscrapers built in the 1980s, and there's a lot of economic activity that kind of revitalizes the cities in a lot of ways. There's still obviously problem areas in the cities, but the downtown area starts to thrive again. And postmodernism, just coincidentally as an architectural style, comes along at the moment when all this economic booming activity is happening. So it's important to kind of define the terms. Postmodernism you can understand as a reaction to something else. You can always understand styles as reactionary in a certain sense. And it's obvious that postmodernism is a reaction to modernism, right? So first I want to just kind of go over the tenets of modernism, and then we can understand how postmodernism distinguishes itself from modernism in terms of architecture. So in modernism, you can think of the idea of what they called the international style, this idea of a unified approach, where basically there was a style that was very minimalist and stripped down, and it could be universally used in any location in the whole world. It was this idea that architecture was universal, right? And it had a unified approach, which is why it's called international. This also means non-regional, so it doesn't refer to the country that it came from. It has much more of an abstracted style to it, non-contextual in that sense, where a flat roof might happen in a place where it rains or in a place where it never rains, right? This modernism becomes this kind of clear break from the past, right? This kind of shedding of traditions and histories, and basically saying, we're in a new era. The Industrial Revolution occurred. We have all new types of building materials, all new possibilities for the creation of buildings. We're inspired by the kind of factory processes of like the Ford Motor Company and like the idea of assemblage and mass production and all of these kinds of things. And they start influencing architecture to the point where in modernism, modern architecture saying we don't need to make our buildings look like Greek temples anymore. We can do what we want and we can make an architecture for our own time, right? So there's this conscious break from the past. Also, the architecture is non-symbolic. It's only representative of construction and the program, the function of the building itself. So this idea that the architecture tells you what it is through some sort of symbolic meaning kind of goes out the window. Modernism is also utopian in a lot of ways. It's ideological. It's kind of saying that the new world, the future world, will be clean and modern and all glass and steel, and you will be able to see everybody and see everything in a very open society, right? Kind of a utopian idea of what society could be like instead of these stuffy old classical buildings that seem very closed off and isolated. There were a lot of other kind of political movements that went with modernism, especially in the early half of the 20th century, where this was kind of an equalizer and an idea that like this was destroying the hierarchies of class through architecture. Some of these kind of ideas, just for an example. And it also espoused this kind of romantic notion of the functionalism, this idea that form follows function, that you can design a building that doesn't have the personality or the stamp of the architect or the artist or designer, that it's much more about solving the problem in a very practical way, almost like treating architecture like it is a science, right? That it's basically just the facts. It's the result of the function that the building needs to have and it's nothing more than that. It's just the structure that holds it up and the function that structure contains. And of course, that's not really how things work, but that was kind of the notion, right? So postmodernism comes along and emerges in it starts rumbling in the late 50s, but by the mid 60s, there's serious books that are starting to come out, and I'll go over those in a little bit, that start showing this kind of like criticism of modern architecture, basically saying that there are problems with modern architecture, and we need to address these things. And so with certain architects, again, they start reacting. It's the younger, newer generations that are reacting to the generations that came before them. So the modern generation was reacting against the classical styles of architecture, and now postmodernism is reacting against the new doctrines of modernism. So in postmodernism, there's an idea of pluralism, this idea that there's no unified style or approach, so it's the opposite of the international style, the idea that like each individual architect has their own unique stamp and way and philosophy of building, and that it's much more individualized. So there's a lot more variety of architecture than just this kind of sanitary kind of modernist look. There's a new emphasis on context and the importance of acknowledging surroundings, region, and culture, basically saying that these things were ignored in the modern movement, like regional building materials, regional customs, cultural aspects, the idea of how the building creates meaning, right? And then context in the sense of like the immediate surroundings of the building as well, and acknowledging those things and making them part of the architectural idea. Going hand in hand with that, there's an acknowledgement of history. Instead of saying we're tearing it all down and we're building it up new for a brave new world, postmodernism is basically saying, let's fold history back in. We've learned a lot from modernism, but let's bring history back and see if we can learn from it, with not necessarily completely copying classical styles, but being inspired and folding them in to create a much more inclusive type of architecture. There's a reintroduction of symbolism, so the idea that architecture can have meaning. Is this possible? And postmodernists really kind of explored this idea. It is also kind of an era of cynicism. It's an ironic period. So you have Andy Warhol around the same time, right? The art movement being kind of blown out of the water. And so there's like this non-utopian idea with postmodernism in a certain sense, that all the promises of modernism that architecture was going to solve society's problems, architects are starting to no longer believe that that's true or possible. So there's a little bit of a cynical quality in postmodernism. And that opens up for a lot of playfulness, absurdity, surrealism, these kinds of things. And overall, it ends up embracing contradictions. So instead of thinking about this kind of one-to-one form follows function idea, postmodernism kind of embraces the fact that architecture is a little bit messy, and that it's trying to do a lot of different things at the same time and not trying to suppress those pluralities of things, right? Two representative examples of modernism: the Seagram Building by Mies van der Rohe, a glass tower, right, in New York. The idea of the quintessential glass box, where the building is clad in bronze, and it has glass all around on all four sides of it, and it has this big plaza in the front. And then the AT&T building, actually Philip Johnson, who designed the AT&T building, also worked on the Seagram Building with Mies van der Rohe in 1958. But Philip Johnson was a little bit of a chameleon of an architect, and he kind of moved with different styles. And the AT&T building, you can see, is kind of this reintroduction of playfulness, whimsy, and also kind of cultural meaning and historical kind of winks, having this kind of really funny kind of hat on the top of the building that is evocative of like an old chest of drawers from like the Chippendale era. And then this kind of archwork, and then these kind of complicated, kind of almost classical looking qualities in the architecture. So you can see the differences between these things. So the big kind of influential factor for postmodernism are Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown. They basically in the late 50s and early 60s started writing books about architecture, and they were much more interested in the inclusiveness of history, And they started folding in a lot more of this stuff. And they basically kind of set the ground rules for a lot of the postmodern ideas that would emerge in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. When they were doing this stuff in the 1960s, it was pretty revolutionary. And it didn't really fully sink in and become mainstream architectural ideas until the 1980s. There's usually these kinds of lags between progressive theory and like kind of general kind of building. Um, so here they are. Robert Venturi just died recently. I think Denise Scott Brown might have just died recently too, but I'll need to check that. There was a big kind of controversy because Robert Venturi was awarded the Pritzker Prize, which is basically like the Nobel Prize for architects. And there was a lot of controversy because he was awarded this prize, but Denise Scott Brown was not also jointly awarded it. And there was a huge kind of pushback and a backlash against that. It was viewed as sexist because they were close collaborators their entire life. They were also husband and wife. So you may remember from all the way back in one of the very first lectures, I showed a Venturi Scott Brown project, this Franklin Court historic site with this kind of framed building and this kind of floor plan. So kind of a postmodern architectural stamping in a very historic district. So one of the most important books that they write is Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture. This is a revolutionary book in the way of thinking about architecture, one of my favorite books. What's really interesting about it is the way that Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown essentially kind of mingle examples from the classical era with examples from the modern era. And this kind of mixing and comparing and contrasting classical architecture with modern architecture was pretty revolutionary for the time. And it really set the groundwork for how postmodernism works. Postmodernism basically folding in all of history, not just the modern history, but also folding in modern history so that the new postmodern architecture is kind of like imagining almost like a new type of architecture of like modernism with a twist, right? With a historical bent to it. With Venturi Scott Brown's book, they kind of create these general tenets of complexity and contradiction. What they're basically saying in the book is that architecture is messy, and that they think that this is actually beautiful. And most architects would criticize this and say that messy architecture is bad or sloppy or done by unintelligent people. But Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown kind of embrace this idea, and they want to embrace the idea of messiness and sloppiness in architecture. So they basically say that they're much more interested in complexity and contradiction in architecture versus the oversimplification of architecture that we often see in modern architecture that tries to solve all problems through oversimplification. There was also this notion of this idea, this kind of semantic idea between both and instead of either or. So instead of saying a building is either one way or another way, they're basically talking about how a complex and contradictory architecture can be both and, right? So if you look at Venturi Scott Brown's famous house that Robert Venturi designed for his mother, Vanna Venturi, you can see examples of this complexity and contradiction. It's not a simple house. You don't just look at it and totally understand it. There's a lot of weird things going on. And this idea of both and also happens because this building is not just a hip kind of traditional looking house that has kind of a gabled roof. It's both that, but then if you look closely, the roof is actually broken. So this is actually just two shed roofs kind of close to each other. So it's both a gabled roof and a shed roof. It's kind of like got two things going on. Over the entrance, there's both an arch and a trabeated beam. So it's double functioning in a certain sense, which is another tenet, the idea of a double functioning element, an element that does more than one thing. Sometimes those things are not even about functioning, they're just about visual symbolism. So the arch obviously isn't doing anything structurally. It only stands as a symbol for structure. You can see that it's cut off by the dual gabled roof. So it's obviously not doing anything structurally. And then there are kind of weird moments where like the chimney moves over to the left. And like you have horizontal windows on one side and square windows on the other side. So it's not an easy composition. It's almost intentionally messy and complicated to to basically frustrate the modernists who would think of this as a crime against architecture. There's also this obligation toward the difficult whole, this idea of, and this philosophy or question of like, how does unity work in architecture? How do we create unity? One way that architects create unity easily is by creating symmetry. And you can see that this building is both symmetrical and asymmetrical. So you can understand that there is an axis down the center, but through that kind of jogged chimney and the weird arrangement of the windows and not having one window on the other side, you get this difficult whole, this difficult symmetry that's also both symmetrical and asymmetrical. Same thing is happening with the Guild House, another project that they were making in the 1960s. What on purpose is kind of something that they're calling ugly and ordinary. They want an architecture that on first glance looks very bland and boring, and they're interested in boring. They're interested in all of the things that modernists kind of criticized about architecture in a very irreverent and playful and kind of cheeky way, right? So this is called the Guild House. It's in Philadelphia. It was a house for elderly people. And it does a lot of things where it's basically just breaking the rules of architecture in a lot of ways. But there's a lot of really interesting things that are happening. First of all, you have symmetry again, right? You can understand that it's symmetry and it's symmetrical, but it kind of breaks a really important rule in architecture, which says that you don't want to have something right down the middle, that you always want to have the middle be kind of open space. So Venturi and Scott Brown put this giant stone column at the base and then break the building in two, which is something that is just basically a taboo, something that is unpleasing to most people's eyes. And then you kind of have these weird square windows, but if you notice, these are wings that are receding further back in the elevation, and the windows start getting bigger and bigger as you go further back. So there are some visual complicated games that are starting to go on in the architecture. And then as an almost like a pop art piece at the top, there's a big kind of television antenna right at the top, is almost like a classical crown on the top of the building. And Robert Venturi, when he's interviewed about this, he basically said, old people like to watch TV. So I wanted to celebrate that. So this is a very kind of Andy Warhol, kind of ironic, kind of joking, offhand way and approach to architecture, where it's not so serious. And modern architects would think that this was horrible, right? They would think that this was, just a little upstart kind of being rebellious for the sake of it. Another really important book that Venturi and Scott Brown worked on was called Learning from Las Vegas. And they basically, again, what they were doing in Complexity and Contradiction was they were looking at architecture in a new way. They were basically saying architecture is interesting, even if it doesn't follow the rules that you think that it should, and that the rules don't really exist, and that you can find beauty in a lot of different things. And another thing that they kind of educated everybody on was the idea that like Las Vegas is a new kind of architectural proposition, a new urban idea that no architects are really looking at because they think it's ugly and they think it's weird and it's perverse and crazy. So Venturi, Scott Brown love this. They go to Las Vegas and they study a new way that like the cities kind of exist. In Learning from Las Vegas, and I'll kind of explain that in a little bit. So this is the cover of the book. This is some of the kind of maps that they were making. So you have like roads, and then these are all just the signs that are on the blocks in Las Vegas. So they're really interested in the signs and the semiotics of the landscape. You have Las Vegas, which, from very early on was a town that you could get a divorce in. So people would flock to Las Vegas to legally get a divorce kind of easily. And all of a sudden there were other lax laws in Las Vegas. So you were able to have gambling establishments, get a divorce, all these kinds of things. And seemingly overnight, the town just sprouted up in the middle of the desert and became kind of the gambling hub, which it still is to this day. And what's happening and what Venturi and Scott Brown are kind of noticing is the architecture starts vanishing and the signage becomes much more important than the buildings themselves. So you can see buildings like this that they're interested in where the sign is really important. There's all these big parking lots because it's all about the car, right? You have a big kind of billboard, and the architecture itself is very boring and uninteresting, and they don't care about the architecture. They're interested in the signage itself. And so there's images like this in the book that basically show that the architecture is completely obliterated, and all you really see now is just information, things that are trying to get your attention to make you a consumer and make you buy stuff, right? So, and it's also, again, it's all about the car, right? It's the scale of this signage is so big that it's meant to attract you from the car, and it's not meant to it's not meant to be on the same scale for a pedestrian. That's not as important to them. So this basically emerges because of the car, because of the gambling, because of the consumerist kind of overload that's happening in Vegas. You start to get this completely different aesthetic in the city. And at night, the buildings almost totally vanish, and you just get these large kind of neon signs that become kind of magical. There's the famous cowboy who kind of is waving, and the golden nugget. So what they kind of take out of this is they start making observations about the city itself, and then they start making these categories of how you think about architecture in a different way. And the two kind of major proponents that they talked about in Learning from Las Vegas was the idea of a building as a duck or a decorated shed. And a building as a duck, you can see, is that this building might sell like duck merchandise, right? The idea was that the building is meant to attract you, and sometimes it's about form following function, where you might be able to buy duck or ducks in this building, and so it looks like a duck, right? So it's basically that the advertisement for the building becomes the building itself. And so again, it's about the car, right? These are sketches that are in the book that kind of show the idea of the relationship between the car going by quickly and being attracted by the duck that makes you want to go and visit it. It's kind of like a novelty, right? The other way to look at it is the concept of the decorated shed, which we just saw a bunch of examples in Las Vegas. This idea that the building doesn't matter anymore, that the sign is all that actually matters, and that the sign is big and it says eat, and it's right by the edge of the highway, and so the car can see the signage. And this kind of also goes back a little bit to like the Wild West. If you imagine buildings that had the kind of false facades that said eat on them, on the back actually they're just kind of a boring old building that doesn't do much, but the building kind of creates a billboard for itself. So this photograph that they use to talk about the decorated shed basically shows that the building doesn't matter. It's all about the sign. It's all about the information and the visual and its relationship to the vehicle, and this kind of fast-moving consumer culture. So basically, this is Denise Scott Brown. Our thesis is that most architects' buildings today are ducks, buildings where an expressive aim has distorted the whole beyond the limits of economy and convenience, and that this, although an unadmitted one, is a kind of decoration, and a wrong and costly one at that. So what they're basically saying is that the duck is kind of the way that architecture in the last 20 or so years, with some of these kind of large projects that are getting built, are kind of over the top. There's too much. So they're not necessarily literally images of animals or things, but they're kind of over bloated architectural elements that don't seem to have much of a relationship with the function that goes into it. So it's a little bit of a criticism of those kinds of architecture. But at the same time, they're also criticizing the sparseness of modern architecture. So there's kind of this weird playfulness going on. And here's just another chart kind of showing the difference between a decorated shed and a duck. And I'll show you some actual examples of these in a second. So here's a good example of a duck, right? The Longaberger Basket Company headquarters in Dresden, Ohio from 1997. Longaberger Basket Company, your parents probably all have one of these, or your grandma or your aunt has one of these baskets. And so the building literally looks like a basket. You can literally see that these are windows and these are different floors of the building. And even the fake nails are up there, but they're huge. They're probably the size of stop signs. And then you got this big handle. So the handle is not about function, right? There's no function to the handle. It only has a symbolic function, a visual function. And even the signage on the basket is similar to what you see in real life. So it looks like a giant came along and just dropped this building in the middle of a field. And this is what is called a duck, right? It advertises what it does just by how it looks. And then this is a good example of a decorated shed, this kind of very cheap building. If you look, it's painted blue and it's just concrete blocks and it's just a flat roof. And so it's a very boring, dull building like the back of a Target or a Walmart, right? And so all of the architecture has gone into the sign, which is this big Basco sign, these big letters that are like 20 or 30 feet high. That kind of advertise themselves from the road so that you are drawn to the building and you want to see it. So you can see that the building doesn't matter, but the sign is where all of the architectural work goes into it. In Las Vegas now in the 1990s, you can see the buildings as kind of a hybrid between ducks and sheds and decorated sheds, where they are both billboards and they are turning into things that advertise themselves, kind of these over-the-top kind of stage sets, and that this is a whole building back here, right? You can see this building is like a steam ship from like the Mississippi River days. So the building looks like a steamship. And on top of that, you have all these kind of billboards and lights and all these things going on. There's kind of a complex mixture of decorated sheds and ducks. The big pyramid, the Luxor Pyramid Hotel, looks like a pyramid, right? So there's a big thing in the front. So it's all about appearances. The fake skyline of New York, this is one normal sized building that's made to look like a bunch of different buildings that are famous landmarks from New York. Um, and then going on from this, they're basically just saying, hey, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in Las Vegas, right? And architects are too much of snobs to look at this stuff. And we're finding all of these new ideas and new ways of thinking about architecture just by going to a place that most people would turn their noses up at. So there's a lot of playfulness, a lot of irreverence, a lot of kind of like burn down your darlings kind of philosophy that's happening in the postmodern era, which becomes a very playful kind of era. So another architect that kind of emerges that's important is Michael Graves. And again, like I'm talking about all these architects that I'm going to talk about today, it's important to keep these tenets of postmodernism in the back of your mind, especially the first one I mentioned, which is plurality. The idea that like each individual architect has their own specific philosophy and approach to design. And so it's not about trying to be unified in an approach like was happening in modernism. It's all about like, this is my unique take on architecture and I want to express my ideas. And so postmodernism is not a style in that sense. Postmodernism is a state of mind. So you can see many different examples in the 80s and 90s of architecture that looks extremely different from each other. But you can all categorize all of those things under the idea of postmodernism. So Michael Graves is a really important postmodern architect. This is one of his kind of comments. So Venturi Scott Brown were interested in history, contradiction, complexity in architecture, and also some of the messy kind of pop art, ugly, boring things that were neglected, misfit architectural ideas. And Michael Graves comes along and has a different philosophy about architecture. He says the poetic form of architecture is responsive to issues external to the building and incorporates the three-dimensional expression of the myths and rituals of society. Poetic forms in architecture are sensitive to the figurative, associative, and anthropomorphic attitudes of a culture. If one's goal is to build with only utility in mind, then it is enough to be conscious of technical criteria alone. However, once aware of and responsive to the possible cultural influences on building, it is important that society's patterns of ritual be registered in the architecture. So in this quote, you can see that Michael Graves is basically criticizing modern architecture. He's saying that it puts too much of an emphasis on utility and the technical criteria alone. And he's basically saying that's not enough, that architecture also has a cultural meaning that is specific to its location where it's built, and that these cultural meanings are important to also communicate in the architecture. This is a very postmodern idea, right? So the idea that the modernists left something out. This is a drawing by Michael Graves of Michael Graves wearing one of his buildings. And this is a drawing of Michael Graves, and we'll see more of his work in a little bit. Um, so just to get your mind in this mindset of this idea of like the architects all having their kind of own philosophies, this is certainly true in modern architecture. It's a myth to think that everybody was on the same page in the modern era. You could find just as much plurality in the modern era, but the myth of modern architecture is that it was much more unified. And the myth of postmodernism is perhaps that it was ununified, that it was all about every man, woman, and child for themselves. So Michael Hayes in his introduction kind of talks about the difference between a couple different architects, which is Michael Graves and Peter Eisenman. He says building for Michael Graves encompasses instrumental aspects inherent to its practice, while architecture strives to symbolically represent culture and its myths. So he's saying that Michael Graves is finds culture as an important thing that is in architecture. It is significant that Graves identifies the symbolic functions as responding to cultural issues, so he's interested in ideas of culture. In contrast to others like Peter Eisenman's desire for an autonomous architecture or an architecture based in philosophy or literary criticism. Graves and Eisenman are considered representatives of polar positions. So Eisenman, who I'll show in a second, basically had kind of an opposite way. He was not interested in culture, but he was also not interested in the kind of functionalism of modern architecture. And I'll show you examples of this in a bit because it's probably a little weird to try to understand. So again, just to kind of hit this home, postmodernism did not have one unified theory of design. This is why it was called a pluralist architectural movement. So with Peter Eisenman, he had this idea of what he called autonomous architecture. And he's basically talking about buildings that have sacrificed function to form. What he's basically saying is that he wants architecture to free itself from all of its obligations towards humans, culture, history, function, use. So even the modern era was too much obligations on architecture, and Peter Eisenman was trying to understand if it was possible for architecture to be a purely artistic idea, an idea of pure art, and just like an inhabited sculpture in a certain sense, right? But instead of using the language of art, Peter Eisenman is wondering if there is a language of architecture that can be used. So Venturi Scott Brown would kind of criticize these ideas and call them ducks, right? Architecture that goes beyond its function and just kind of shows off its creative ideas, but it doesn't have any meaning behind it. It's kind of a strange hybrid or a weird kind of architecture. So Eisenman makes these series of houses in the 1960s and 70s that are just named after numbers that kind of interrogate what architecture is supposed to be. And so he takes kind of ideas of modern architecture and he completely twists them around. He basically takes the cube, the pure cube of a modern house, and then he rotates the structure and the walls at a 45-degree angle, as you can see in these diagrams. And then he adds and subtracts walls and columns and windows so that the building goes beyond its usefulness, and it no longer has a function. It's all kind of visual form, but it is not what Michael Graves would talk about in terms of the idea of cultural form, where the shapes of the buildings have some sort of a meaning, right? There's no meaning here. This is the idea of a pure architectural expression of walls, windows, columns, and these kinds of things. So what happens is you have really complicated and messy spaces because of all these kind of contradictions that are happening in the work. You have columns right in the middle of living rooms. There's one famous example where one of the columns goes right through the middle of the master bed in the master bedroom. So it's basically the architecture is kind of anti-functional in a certain sense. So that's a critique against modernism. And then it's also kind of anti-meaningful. It's not trying to be culturally relevant or important in that sense. It's trying to see if it can be a pure artistic expression. And so people be damned, right? So this becomes really challenging as an idea, kind of the limit condition of where architecture can kind of go. So you can see with these drawings that he's making that he's really interested in the walls, he's really interested in windows, columns, all of these kind of elements of architecture arranged in these kind of chaotic and systematic ways of addition and subtraction and rotation and movement to create these extremely complicated spaces. So he makes buildings like this. Here's another one of the houses in Connecticut where it's also about like this is not supposed to look like a house, right? There's none of that symbolic or cultural meaning in the building that tells you that this is a house. There's no discernible chimney. There's no discernible roof that tells you like where's the front entrance, all of these kinds of questions. Where there should be a column, there's a void and a glass strip instead. The roofs kind of vanish and disappear. You get repetitions that are unnecessary, and all of a sudden the architecture becomes very confusing and it doesn't make any sense, and you don't know what you're looking at, and you don't know what things are. And so it's this idea that the architecture is a pure sculpture. So another architect that kind of emerges in this kind of array of all these famous emerging architects that come out in the postmodern era is Frank Gehry. And he starts in the 1970s really kind of taking off. And his early work is a lot different than his later work, but it's again this kind of irreverent playfulness with architectural elements. But Gehry approaches things in a totally different way than Eisenman. Eisenman was doing this kind of weird grid, kind of repetition stuff. And Frank Gehry is doing a lot more of a deconstructed look. This idea of cheap materials, corrugated aluminum, plywood staircase made out of like skiffs, chain link fence used in an architectural, sculptural way. So what he's really kind of interrogating the kind of snobbishness of modern architecture by taking all of these kind of boring and ugly things and making them in this seemingly chaotic fashion. So you have this weird turquoise concrete wall and these stairs that look like they just fell in place, and there's no rhyme or reason or proportional systems that make sense. The door is just a cheap piece of plywood, and the glass is this explosion in the corner of the building that looks like a meteor fell through it or something. And then on the inside, it's like intentionally unfinished looking, this kind of idea of deconstruction where the living room is basically a stud wall that isn't plastered over, so there's no insulation and that kind of stuff. So it looks like an unfinished architecture, right? And then in the kitchen, you have the same thing where it looks like a tree fell in the building or something, and it's like partially collapsed. So another way to think about architecture and to do architecture. This is a school in Loyola that he worked on. And again, you can see that this is actually the front entrance of the school, but it kind of looks like the back loading dock or something. It doesn't make any sense as an architectural object. And what Frank Gehry says is that this is not a plan. I took trouble to disorganize it. I didn't want the design to be recognizable. So this idea of like an architecture that's a lot messier, a lot more contradictory and crazy looking, and made with like cheap materials used in an almost pop art kind of way, kind of like a Duchamp or an Andy Warhol kind of idea, to make this architecture that doesn't follow existing rules of logic. It's much more about a strange experience and kind of a surreal experience. Frank Gehry's style developed over a long period of time and got smoother and more refined as time went on. And this is a quintessential example of kind of the trademark Frank Gehry style that you get in his later years. This is the Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles. And you can see now his forms have gotten much more unified, and they're all in kind of the same material, but they all kind of have these similar geometric shapes. But it's definitely a duck, right? These shapes are not related to function. These shapes are related to visual sculptural elements that are meant to look playful. So back to Michael Graves and this idea of culture and architecture. Michael Graves doesn't start out that way. So his early style in the 60s is very much inspired by modern architects, Le Corbusier and the modernists in Europe, making these kind of modern looking houses, but they're a little bit more complicated. So they're a little bit like Peter Eisenman, where it's kind of hard to understand what you're looking at. It's like where is inside, where is outside, these kinds of questions. And you've got these kind of colorful moments of beams and this kind of aesthetic that looks a little bit like a liner, an ocean liner. And these kind of inscrutable shapes, like this weird kind of curve up here, these lions added in, and these kind of multicolors and all these kinds of things. So the architecture's very much in the style of modernism, but when you look closely, it's got a lot more weird things going on. And it's hard to understand exactly what he's thinking. But again, it's this kind of postmodern idea of kind of goofiness in architecture. Another one, the Hanselman House. Again, it's kind of got that white purity of like modern functionalism, but it's much more playful and strange. And there's weird moments where you can kind of see a staircase behind that wall right there with that slash. And you've got these colorful elements and these kind of elements that kind of pop out of the building. So this wall kind of pulls itself away from the building. And then you have this bridge that kind of goes up and connects you to the front entrance. So an architecture that's very much kind of in that Peter Eisenman style of kind of autonomous architecture, where it's basically about pure form making and it's a sculptural artistic object and it's not about function, right? So it's anti-modernist in that sense. But Michael Graves kind of abandons this kind of style as he develops over the 1970s. And by the 1980s, he has fully investigated a whole new way of making architecture, folding in some of those quotes that I mentioned about this idea of culture and cultural meaning in architecture. So kind of his big break as an architect was the Portland building from 1980. And this was a really famous building that basically signaled the modern, or sorry, the kind of popular era of postmodernism, where the 1980s was just nothing but postmodernism. The Philip Johnson Tower, the one that I showed you earlier, was also built in the same year. So on the east and the west coast, you had these two extremely influential and popular buildings that were built in 1980 that were in the postmodern, playful, kind of weird, cultural, kind of pseudo-classical style that just basically exploded and started getting built everywhere. So the Portland building basically made Portland more famous as a city, but also made Michael Graves kind of an international celebrity as an architect. And it's basically this playful kind of cultural architectural style that he cultivates. And when I think of the word postmodernism, even though it is about pluralism and this idea that there's many different styles, this is the kind of architecture that I instantly think of when I think of postmodernism, is this kind of colorful, blocky, playful, like overblown, large classical details kind of stamped onto a weird looking building, right? So you've got all these kind of classical allusions in the architecture. This almost looks like a Greek column right here with this kind of weird thing. This kind of has a quality of a big keystone at the top of an arch, but it's kind of reformulated, rescaled, and it doesn't have the meaning that it once had. So it's very playful and strange. And then the windows themselves are these weird little dots in the facade. So there are a bunch of different facade studies that Michael Graves made, kind of showing the playfulness and the multiple variety of ways that the building could be made, right? It's basically just a cheap building. It's like a decorated shed almost. And then Michael Graves is kind of adding all of this stuff onto it. And in the interior, it's kind of a utilitarian building, except for the kind of grand entrance that has these hallways. There's kind of this pseudo-classical style on the inside. The entrance is kind of bleak and gross, very cheap looking. The building is actually under threat of destruction because it's not very popular anymore. People consider it very ugly. I would agree with that in a certain sense, but I do think it's historically an important piece of architecture. So I have mixed feelings about that. Here's the interior, kind of, again, that kind of stripped down classical look. So something that modern architects would kind of hate. They would hate this look of like classical architecture. They would say that this person is going back in time and reappropriating the styles of the past. You know, there's symmetry, there's classical monumental architectural expression in the architecture, but it's totally twisted around. The sizes are bloated and scaled differently. And so it's nothing like classical architecture, but it has classical architectural ideas inside of it. Another example, the Humana building in Louisville. Again, this is a building that to an architect, when they look at something like this, they're going to start making associations. To me, it looks like it could be Egyptian architecture, it could be an Adolf Loos building, it could be there are moments of modernism, there are moments of classicism, like it kind of looks like a Greek colonnade at the bottom. There's this kind of pyramid. So there's all of these different styles kind of mixed together in this kind of soup of different architectural elements. Even this kind of like arched crane thing kind of looks like a Russian constructivist thing from the 1920s. So Michael Graves is having a lot of fun in the postmodern era and just mixing and matching a bunch of different ideas together using color and materials, all of these things that were considered a little bit more of a taboo in the modern era, which was much more serious and much more about functionalism, right? There's nothing functionalist about a lot of these elements. They're all just kind of very exaggerated architectural elements. So again, it's like a decorated shed with a little bit of a duck on top. And then these are the interior spaces. Again, this kind of stripped down classicism. So it reminds you of classical architecture, but it isn't actually classical architecture. Very popular in the 1980s. You're probably seen interiors like this in your life. So there's a good example of a postmodern building that's in this kind of Michael Graves style on campus. The molecular biology building is very much an example of postmodernism. You have the kind of weird symbolic images of, I think, DNA on the sides of the building, and then you have this kind of weird parallelogram kind of court in the middle. And then you have these kind of decorated objects up at the top, these kind of creatures. I can't remember. They have some sort of a genetic code meaning behind them. I'm not exactly sure what they are. They were at threat of being taken down, but I think that they decided to keep them, which I think is kind of important. But if you want to kind of take a trip back into the late 80s and early 90s, and you feel nostalgia for that period, this is a fun building to just walk around in and kind of see that kind of postmodern quality. So here's another project by Michael Graves. And again, when I'm talking about this idea of cultural meaning, Michael Graves is interested in the way that these architectural, classical, kind of stripped down classical motifs in his architecture seem to have some sort of meaning beyond themselves and have associations. So he's really interested in the way people react to his architecture and how they feel that it fits in. So for a library in San Juan Capistrano in California, he is interested in the context and the local and the regional culture of the location that influences and informs his design. So he'll take the material of white stucco that is the building style of the area and the red clay tile roof tiles, and he'll incorporate those in his building so that the building makes sense in this area, right? It's regional, it's contextual. This is the opposite of modern architecture, which was not interested in having an affinity or a relationship with the architecture around it. So Michael Graves is very much interested in the way that this building evokes the kind of classical and maybe even pre-American, maybe when this part of California was occupied by the Spanish and the Mexicans, right? So there's a little bit of that quality in the architecture. Here's kind of an axonometric view, kind of showing there's this kind of courtyard in the center. And these kind of weird cellular structures. So in the center, you have kind of a courtyard with a kind of a classic fountain that you would see in traditional Mexican architecture. So he's taking traditions and customs, architectural traditions as well, and he's kind of putting them in his architecture with this kind of minimalist, kind of stripped down classicism. And these are what the spaces on the inside look like. So again, kind of feeling like classical architecture, but with a kind of a modern, postmodern twist on them. And Michael Graves kind of was very much a holistic architect, a lot like, if you know Frank Lloyd Wright, the idea that like everything is designed by the architect. So the furniture is designed by Michael Graves, the lamp is designed by Michael Graves, and the entire total environment that you're in is curated by the architect. And so you have this kind of total experience that is immersive. Here's another one where, again, it's the cultural meaning is inscribed in the architecture itself. In a sense, that's like a duck because it's telling you what it is. This is the Teen Disney building in Burbank, California. So it makes sense that the Disney building itself is held up by the seven dwarfs. So he's using these architectural elements, which are called caryatids. They were popular in ancient Greek architecture. And they were like figures that held up a building. So basically humans as columns that hold up a building. And then playfully using these as the columns that hold up the building in the Disney building, right? So this is a really clear, to me, example of this idea of putting cultural meaning and ideas into the architecture itself. So it's not just about form follows function, it's also symbolism follows function as well. And it tells you what it is by the architectural ornaments that are on the outside of the building. And it does it in a very playful and fun way. A fun way that maybe has not aged that well. So we look at these buildings now and we think that they're kind of dated, that they're kind of poorly done now. And the color scheme and all this kind of bloated, kind of classical architectural look has definitely gone out of style. It was very much stylistic. But you get these kind of strange, like kind of classical spaces where you have kind of classical Doric Greek columns, but they're really, really big and they're proportionately out of place in the small space. So they kind of feel like they're crowding you. And they're in these kind of flamboyant colors, these greens and these kind of earth colors. And then you have these kind of murals that Michael Graves would have designed that go in the space and create this kind of total environment where even the plates were designed by Michael Graves and the chairs have Mickey Mouse kind of inscribed in the back of it. Again, it's this kind of idea that the architecture has a total kind of relationship with what it is and what it's doing. Here is the Swan Hotel in Orlando, Florida. So again, this is a little bit like a decorated shed, just kind of a cheap kind of structure of a hotel, but then decorated with all of these kind of ornaments. So you have this kind of painting of like waves on the building. And you have these giant swan sculptures and these big clamshells up at the top. These things are not about function, right? The swan does not perform any function. It's purely symbolic, which is something that modern architects would not be a big fan of. And the architecture, the floor plan itself is also very strange. Michael Graves kind of creates these moments of discovery in episodes where every time you're walking into a space, you're in kind of a hall, and then you kind of go down a very small hall, and you're constantly met with these different spaces. So you got a octagon space, and then you go down this long hallway and you end up in a circular space, and then you go down another long hallway and you end up in a big rectangular space, and these kinds of things, right? So it's kind of this like kind of journey and experience as you're going through the space. And these are the kinds of spaces that you get when you get down the end of those long hallways. You get these moments where a space kind of reminds you of a tent, right? It looks like it's painted like a tent, so it almost feels like you're outside. Again, with this, especially with the big fake plants. And then here's the Swan Fountain with this big Michael Graves painting up above. So everything is kind of curated by Michael Graves in these color schemes. This is from 1989. I would love to see what this hotel looks like now. I wonder if they've totally remodeled it or if it looks the same, because it's certainly kind of a dated look, but at some point this is going to all come back in style and be cool again. Here's this Garden Grove Cafe. You know, again, it kind of this feeling of an outdoor space where you almost feel like you're under a canopy of like a big garden trellis with all these kind of palm trees and things like that and this wicker furniture. And then again, you can see Michael Grave paintings off in the distance of trees, bundled columns. So very much kind of classical architecture with a twist in the kind of Michael Graves style. Even in the hallways of the hotel rooms, you have paintings by Michael Graves. You have carpets by Michael Graves, light fixtures, sconces on the wall. They're designed by Michael Graves. And even when you get to the bedroom, you have all Michael Graves stuff. Bedspreads, light fixtures, this hilarious pineapple light fixture, and this kind of weird plant light, and this kind of weird fabric. All the stuff is totally outdated. I would love to see if any of this has survived. So if anybody's been to this hotel, let me know. And then he also created another one nearby called the Dolphin Hotel, which is doing the same things, right? Paint a cheap building that's painted, that has these big sculptural elements at the top that kind of advertise itself as a magical, wonderful place. But it is a decorated shed, right? If you look closely, it's just kind of a cheap building, and it has almost this camouflage of craziness on top of it. Here it is from the inside. Again, those kind of spaces that remind you of tents, like you're inside of a giant tent, or like you're underwater, so you have all these fish kind of floating above you, or you're in like a big giant fruit basket and you're hanging out here. So very whimsical architecture, very irreverent, surreal, bizarre, fantastical architecture. Architecture that's meant to be fun and playful. Things that postmodern architects would basically be saying as a criticism of modernism, which was really very serious and very kind of to the point and very functional. So this is an architecture that you may react to it and think that it's ugly and weird looking right now, but it's important to understand this in the context of what immediately came before it, which was much more serious architecture, right? Another architect, Charles Moore, creates some really interesting kind of reappropriations of historical architecture in a postmodern world. So what Charles Moore does is he takes kind of classical architectural elements and puts his own twist on them. So this Piazza d'Italia is a really interesting example in New Orleans, where it kind of, the entrance is this kind of, if you blur your eyes, you'll think that it looks basically like a little Greek or Roman temple. But it's a really kind of minimalist Greek temple, right? Where it's just kind of like metal tubing on the roof and these kind of concrete columns that aren't actually classical columns. When you get into the inside of the piazza, again, you start seeing things that look like classical elements, cornices, Corinthian columns, these kind of arches and arcades that make you think that like maybe you're looking at something from ancient Rome. But when you look closer, things are a little bit more weird. There are fountains and things like that. You can see that like there are actual fountains with mouths and waters coming out of them. In place of a column in this wall, there's actually a stream of water. Some of the columns are clad in like a shiny metal, right? So it doesn't really look like classical architecture here. It kind of has this weird quality. So it's kind of hard to understand, right? You're kind of looking at it and you're making these kind of references or associations to classical architecture, but they're done in such a deconstructed, strange way with these flamboyant colors that it's hard to kind of understand what the architect is getting at. You can even see, even in the little top piece, that there's little tiny fountains kind of popping up through there. So this is the Piazza Italia from above. You can kind of see that that space that I just showed you is kind of right over here. And there's just kind of this big oval that kind of cuts through the whole block. So from the outside, this block is kind of hidden and you kind of walk in the back and you get back here. So here's the floor plan. So that temple that I showed you right at the beginning is over here on the left. And this is the piazza in the back, the big plaza. So that wall that I was showing you with all those weird columns and fountains was over here. And what's interesting is you may have noticed that the floor was also these kind of weird shapes. What it actually is a big fountain that has the topographical features of Italy. So this is the boot of Italy, and it's surrounded by water. So it's literally the Piazza d'Italia. There's not much intelligence behind the thinking here. It's just like literally this is Italy. Literally Italy. That's a fun phrase. Here is a kind of sketch that he made. You can see the boot of Italy, the sketch of the fountain. You start to see the columns start to show up on the sides here. And here it is from above with this kind of spiraling thing and all these kind of weird constructions of walls that aren't quite walls. And here's the space. He called his columns the deli order because he put a bunch of kind of flamboyant fluorescent lights on them. This is a very postmodern move, right? This idea of taking something serious and making it unserious, making it ugly or making it ridiculous. That's a very postmodern idea, right? So the deli order is inspired by what he said, like if you go to a diner on Long Island, a diner that's meant to look like it was built in the 50s, you'll see columns that have fluorescent lights on them. And so that's why he calls it a deli order. And you can start to see the boot of Italy here with the big kind of flamboyant fountain. So just kind of a very strange architectural object. And Charles Moore was, the interesting thing about postmodern architects is not only is each individual architect kind of pursuing their own style and their own approach, but we saw with Michael Graves and Frank Gehry, and now with Charles Moore, that even the architects themselves are constantly changing their styles. So this kind of idea of pluralism is intrinsic in the architecture itself, and that the individual architects themselves are also kind of like, okay, I did it one way, this way, and this project I'm going to try something different. So this idea that like you don't have to just have one style or one unified approach, that you can kind of be experimental and playful with the way that you create architecture. This project is really interesting to me. It's Kresge College in UC Santa Cruz, California. And to me, this is again a criticism of modern architecture, where you have buildings that kind of have a vaguely modern look to them, and I'll show you closer images in a second. But they're arranged in almost a willfully random way. It's almost like an intentional accident, right? Where he's trying to make these things look like it's an ancient village that was built on this hill 2,000 years ago in like Italy. And so the buildings just showed up where they are. But this is all manufactured and designed. So it's not actually accidental, but it is carefully designed to look accidental. So the buildings themselves are pretty stripped down. They kind of look like modern architecture. They're not as flamboyant as Michael Graves' architecture that we just saw. But he's usually adding splashes of really bright colors in certain strategic locations to kind of take them away from the pure modernist look, the kind of pure white look. And you have these kind of weird moments of geometric shapes that kind of become very playful. This kind of playfulness between outside and inside as well in the architecture. And again, these constant moments of kind of these picturesque accidental moments where it feels like what you're looking at is kind of just an incident and it's not on purpose. But I'm sure it was very carefully studied by Charles Moore. Again, this kind of splashes of color, these really stripped down modern buildings in this beautiful surrounding of surrounded by pine trees. Here's another view, that kind of very bland architecture with these extreme washes of color surrounded by these big trees. And these kind of accidental spaces where you feel like you're just kind of sliding between buildings. So very different than what we just saw with the Piazza d'Italia. Very different from what we saw with Michael Graves, and totally different than what we saw with Frank Gehry and Peter Eisenman. Again, these kind of views, these accidents and these moments and these kind of buildings kind of leading you on, almost feels like maybe you're a pinball in a pinball machine, kind of bouncing off of these buildings as you go through the space. So that's kind of basically a preamble, like I said, to kind of the postmodern conversation that I'll talk about in a future lecture about how these postmodern ideas and trends kind of absorbed themselves into the ideas of urban thinking and the thinking of the American city, and how the American city can be thought of in a different way. So all of these postmodern examples that I was giving you were very influential. And to kind of close up this lecture, I want to give a couple more small examples of the way that postmodernism starts to influence the city scale, not necessarily a large urban plan, but just these kind of small urban moments that are inspired by postmodernism. One of them being the South Street Seaport in New York. This was what it looked like in 1900, so it used to be a very popular harbor, right? Remember, New York was all about the boat and about the water. So the seafront was a very industrial place. There was a lot of importing and exporting, warehousing. So it wasn't like a pleasure ground, right? It was much more of a functional kind of place, kind of a messy place. Falls into disrepair after the emergence of the railroad and then the emergence of the car, and all of a sudden people are like, well, boats are too much of a hassle and they're not economically viable as a transportation of goods and services. So the harbors basically dry up in New York and they become abandoned for a long time. But in the 1980s, this area that is Pier 17 was redeveloped by Rouse and Company and Benjamin Thompson Associates to create this kind of new, kind of vaguely postmodern environment that's basically just a big outdoor mall, a big kind of shopping district in New York City. Here it is on opening day. And what you can see when you look at it is they're trying to kind of preserve the historical kind of fabric of this kind of maritime look, this idea that like ships came here. And so you have this kind of visual quality of like the Pier 17 as a big sign and all this architecture that kind of looks classical or old fashioned, but it's actually brand new. So it's again, it's this architecture that is interested in the cultural meaning of architecture. It's interested in the historical past of the place. And it's architecture that's trying to integrate history with current architecture. So this is no longer a modern looking architectural object, right? This stuff is very popular in the 80s. Even this tiny little ticket stand right in the center here kind of looks like a little tiny tugboat, right? So there's this associationalism that you get in the architecture where you look at a building and you get associations and memories and nostalgias from that architecture. Here it is again. You can see the way that the buildings kind of all have shopping now. So they're no longer industrial warehouses. They've been reappropriated, and now they're like really expensive if you want to get a condo up in one of these, right? So the shopping is still there. And so the seaport has been revitalized, but it's been reappropriated. And that's something we see over and over again in the cities in the 90s, in the 80s, 90s, 2000, and the 21st century, is this revitalization of the waterfront. And we'll look at that in even more detail in a later lecture as well. Another thing that happens around Pier 17 is this kind of redevelopment project by Shop Architects on one of the actual piers, kind of going out into the water. So there are all these series of piers, and we saw this in an earlier lecture as well over in Brooklyn, where you saw those piers that got turned into public parks. You may remember that. By Michael Van Valkenburg and Associates. Here you have another example in downtown Manhattan, kind of in the area of the oldest part of the city, where a long abandoned pier that no longer had boats and maybe even had like an abandoned warehouse building on it or something like that is now getting reused and reappropriated as like a shopping center and a social hub. And the idea is that you would have this building attract people back to the city. So this whole arc of history that we're seeing in the 20th century is you have the great migration of all these kind of African Americans moving up into the northern cities. The city's extremely populating, but then you also have the kind of move to the suburbs precipitated by the car and the way that the car kind of stretches the city out. That results in a lot of white flight. So all of the white citizens of these big cities are basically moving out of the inner ring suburbs and the housing that's closest to downtown, and that is getting left behind and neglected. And so the city is kind of losing its vitality in the later half of the 1900s. And so in the 21st century, there's this big push to try to lure people back into the city and get them to move back into a fancy condo in downtown New York. And they use a building like this to basically say, hey, you can get all your needs in downtown. You can come shopping here. You can hang out. This is a fun place to live, right? So this quote from Shop Architects: the new Pier 17 completely transforms the existing pier into a vibrant destination, building on Lower Manhattan's commercial resurgence, continued residential growth, and evolution into a 24/7 live, work, play community. So the idea is that they're trying to lure you to move to downtown New York, and this is a place where you can live. This is a place where you can walk to work, so almost going back to the idea of the walking city. You can play here. This is a shopping center. There's sports facilities, these kinds of things, gyms. And so the idea is that 24 hours a day you have all your amenities taken care of in this local area that's rich with culture. And that's the idea of the architecture, right? And that revitalization of these kind of old parts of town brings everything kind of full circle back to the idea of coming back and living in the city. And these are questions that are happening right now to this day, and this kind of flux of the city itself is kind of reacting to these things. Okay, that is all I have for today. Here's a final parting shot of Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown in Las Vegas. Thank you.